Have you ever been so invisible that even your pain went unnoticed, not because people couldn't see you, but because seeing you was simply inconvenient for them? What if the most dangerous place a person could be wasn't a dark alley, wasn't a war zone, wasn't some distant corner of the world, but a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside? A house with clean windows, a trimmed lawn, expensive cars in the driveway, and behind every one of those doors, a woman who had learned to make herself small enough to disappear. That woman had a name. Amara. And this is where her story begins, not with a dramatic moment, not with a single catastrophic event, but with something far more insidious. Silence. Routine. The slow, grinding machinery of being treated like you don't quite count as a full human being. Amara had been working in the Hargrove household for 3 years. 3 years of 5 a.m. starts. 3 years of yes ma'am and no ma'am and of course ma'am. 3 years of eating after everyone else had finished, of sleeping in a room barely bigger than a walk-in closet, of watching other people live lives she had once dared to imagine for herself. She wasn't dramatic about it. That's the thing about people who carry heavy loads for a long time. They stop flinching under the weight. They just walk. Head down. Forward. Because stopping means thinking, and thinking means feeling, and feeling means remembering everything she'd worked so hard to bury. She had come to the city with a plan. Most people who end up in situations like hers didn't plan to be there, and Amara was no different. She had been studying business administration, 2nd year, full scholarship. She had a roommate who laughed too loud and a professor who told her she had a sharper mind than half the students he'd taught in 20 years. She had a future that felt, for the first time in her life, like something she could actually hold. And then one phone call. One legal document. One family crisis that ripped the floor from under everything she'd built, and suddenly the scholarship was gone, the apartment was gone, and the options had narrowed down to one. Work. Survive. Figure out the rest later. But here's what nobody tells you about survival mode. Later has a way of never coming. And the Hargrove household had a way of making sure of it. Mrs. Hargrove wasn't a villain in the theatrical sense. She didn't monologue. She didn't sneer. She simply had a very precise and practiced way of making Amara feel like an appliance that had developed the unfortunate habit of having feelings. Requests came with no pleas. Criticism came with no warning. And when Amara made a mistake, even something minor, even something anyone would make, the response was always disproportionate. Always designed to remind her exactly where she stood. Which was somewhere beneath consideration. The other staff noticed. They said nothing. Because in houses like the Hargrove estate, you learned quickly that the safest position was the one closest to invisible. And Amara had mastered that position better than anyone. She moved through rooms like she was trying not to disturb the air. She answered questions before they became demands. She anticipated moods the way a sailor reads weather, not because she wanted to, but because getting it wrong had consequences she couldn't afford. She had no safety net, no family nearby, no savings worth mentioning, and a visa situation that Mrs. Hargrove was not above referencing whenever Amara looked even a fraction too confident. That detail, that one quiet, devastating detail, is what kept Amara exactly where she was. And somewhere on the other side of that same house, completely unaware that any of this was happening beneath his own roof, lived a man named Ethan Hargrove. And what he was about to discover, about the woman his family had treated like furniture, was going to shatter something in him that no amount of money or status would ever fully put back together. Something was already shifting in that house, slowly, quietly, the way cracks form in foundations long before the walls start showing damage. And the question isn't whether Ethan was going to find out. The question is, what kind of man would he turn out to be when he did? What does a man do when he realizes the life he's been proud of was built on a foundation he never once thought to inspect? Ethan Hargrove was the kind of man that rooms noticed before he spoke. Not because he demanded attention, that was his mother's style, loud and deliberate, but because he carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned very early that power didn't need to announce itself. 34 years old, co-founder of a mid-size investment firm that had quietly outperformed firms 3 times its size for the past 6 consecutive quarters. The kind of success that got written about in financial publications but kept off social media because Ethan had a deep, almost allergic aversion to performance. He didn't need people to know he'd made it. He knew. That was enough. Or at least, that's what he told himself on the nights when the apartment above the Hargrove estate felt less like a retreat and more like a very well-furnished holding cell. He had moved back into the family property 14 months ago, a decision that made complete sense on paper and absolutely none in practice. His mother had experienced a health scare, his father had been traveling internationally for work more months than not, and the estate needed someone present who could actually make decisions. Ethan was the eldest. Ethan was responsible. Ethan had spent the better part of his life being the person who showed up when things got complicated, and so he showed up again, packed 2 bags, sublet his city apartment, and told himself it was temporary. 14 months later, temporary had quietly become indefinite, the way it always does when you're the only person in a family willing to hold things together. The truth about Ethan, the version that didn't appear in boardroom presentations or at his mother's dinner parties, was that he was profoundly lonely in a way he wouldn't have known how to articulate even if someone had asked. And nobody asked. Because from the outside, Ethan Hargrove had the architecture of a complete life. The career. The family name. The social circle that expanded and contracted based on usefulness rather than genuine connection. He dated occasionally, women who were impressive and interesting and with whom he shared precisely nothing that actually mattered. He ended things politely, always with good reasons, and always with a private suspicion that the real reason was something he hadn't yet identified in himself. He was fluent in the language of having everything and still feeling like something essential was missing, but he'd never once sat still long enough to translate it. What Ethan was not, despite all of this, was oblivious. That distinction matters. He was distracted, yes. Consumed by work, by obligation, by the constant low-level management of his family's expectations. Absolutely. But oblivious? No. Which is why, on a Tuesday morning in October, when he came downstairs 20 minutes earlier than usual because a conference call had been rescheduled, and he walked into the kitchen to find Amara standing at the counter with her back to him, he noticed. Not her, specifically. Not yet. What he noticed was the way she moved. Carefully. The way someone moves when they're used to being corrected for taking up too much space. He'd seen that particular quality of movement before, in a junior analyst at his firm who turned out to have been enduring months of quiet workplace harassment before anyone in a position to act had paid enough attention to see it. He poured his coffee. She didn't turn around. He said, "Good morning." There was a half-second pause, the kind of pause that carries weight, before she responded. "Yes, good morning, sir." Efficient, practiced, and completely devoid of the ease that a simple good morning should carry between 2 people who had been living under the same roof for over a year. Ethan took his coffee to his office and opened his laptop. But he didn't start the call prep he'd planned. He sat for a moment with the specific discomfort of a man who has just noticed something he can't unnotice, turning it over in his mind the way you turn over a stone you're not entirely sure you want to look beneath. He started paying attention after that. Not intrusively, not in any way that announced itself, but in the quiet, methodical way that was simply his nature, the same way he assessed risk in a business context, the same way he read a room before deciding how to move within it. And what he saw, over the next several days, was a pattern. A very specific, very deliberate pattern of diminishment that his mother had apparently been conducting for years, right underneath his nose, in his own family home. The realization didn't arrive loudly. It arrived the way the most uncomfortable truths always do, quietly, undeniably, and with a particular weight of knowing that not seeing it sooner was its own kind of failure. Ethan Hargrove was a man who fixed problems. It was practically coded into him. But what he was looking at wasn't a problem with a clean solution, it was a person. A person who had been quietly wronged inside his own home. And the decision he was about to make wasn't going to come from his head. For the first time in a very long time, it was going to come from somewhere he'd almost forgotten he had. If someone offered you a lifeline disguised as a risk, would you have the courage to grab it, or would the fear of drowning feel safer than trusting a stranger's hand? It didn't happen the way these things happen in stories. There was no grand moment, no orchestrated setting, no carefully chosen words delivered across a candlelit table. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, in the estate's side hallway, between a coat rack and a wall calendar, because that is where Ethan happened to be standing when he overheard the phone call that changed the entire trajectory of what he thought he was going to do about Amara's situation. He hadn't been looking for a reason to act. He'd been building toward a conversation with his mother, measured, reasonable, the kind of conversation he'd rehearsed in his head 3 times over, about the way Amara was being treated and what needed to change immediately. That conversation was still coming. But what he heard in that hallway rearranged the urgency of everything. His mother's voice, carrying from the sitting room with the particular confidence of a woman who had never once worried about being overheard in her own home. A phone call with someone Ethan recognized by tone if not by name, a family acquaintance, older, connected, the kind of man whose influence moved through channels that didn't show up in public records. And the subject of their conversation was Amara. Specifically, her visa status. Specifically, a complaint that had apparently been filed, or was being prepared, that would trigger a review. And most specifically, a very calm, very deliberate discussion about how certain paperwork might be handled in ways that would make Amara's continued presence in the country extraordinarily difficult. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was casual. The way powerful people discuss the fates of people they don't consider quite real. Ethan stood in that hallway for 11 seconds. He counted, later, because his mind had the strange habit of tracking details when the rest of him was absorbing a shock. 11 seconds of absolute stillness. And then something shifted in him. Not rage, not exactly, though there was rage in it. Something older and more decisive than rage. A clarity. The kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't wait for a more convenient moment. He walked into his home office, closed the door, and spent the next 40 minutes on the phone with his own legal counsel, mapping the fastest and most ironclad solution to what he now understood was not simply an employment issue or a family conflict. It was a targeted dismantling of a woman's life by people who had the resources to make it look entirely procedural. The answer, when it came, was not the one he'd expected to arrive at. But it was the only one that worked within the timeline they had, given the wheels that were already in motion. Marriage. Specifically, his marriage to Amara, which would immediately and comprehensively resolve every immigration vulnerability being exploited against her, remove the leverage his mother and her associates were using, and place Amara in a legal position that no quiet phone call to a well-connected acquaintance could touch. His lawyer paused after Ethan laid it out. Then said carefully that it was legally sound, practically effective, and personally one of the more unusual decisions he'd seen a client arrive at in 20 years of practice. Ethan said he understood. He thanked him. He hung up. And then he went to find Amara. She was in the garden, collecting linens from the drying line, and she didn't hear him approach until he was close enough that turning around was slightly startling. He apologized for the surprise. She said it was fine, the way she said most things, efficiently, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had long ago stopped volunteering reactions. He asked if she had a few minutes. She looked at him the way people look when they're trying to calculate whether a request is innocent or the beginning of something they'll need to brace for. She said yes. They sat at the small iron table near the garden wall, and Ethan, who was exceptionally good at delivering difficult information in professional settings, found himself briefly and uncharacteristically uncertain about how to begin. So he simply began. He told her what he'd heard. He watched her face move through the specific geography of someone receiving confirmation of a fear they'd been carrying alone. And then, before she could respond to that, he told her his solution. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone considering. It was the silence of someone whose entire internal architecture had just been handed something it didn't have a category for. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, quietly, what he would get out of it. It was the right question. It was the question of someone who had learned, through direct and repeated experience, that nothing extended in her direction came without a cost she'd eventually be asked to pay. Ethan told her the truth, which was that he wanted nothing beyond the resolution of an injustice happening inside his own home, and that the arrangement would be entirely on her terms, documented, and dissoluble the moment she was in a position where she no longer needed the protection it provided. No expectations. No obligations beyond the legal paperwork. No performance of anything she didn't choose. He slid a single handwritten note across the table, 3 lines, outlining exactly what he was proposing and exactly what he was not. He told her to take whatever time she needed to think about it. She picked up the note, read it twice, and said she would have an answer by morning. She went back to her room that night with a piece of paper that could change everything and a head full of every reason not to trust it. Because hope, when you've been without it long enough, stops feeling like relief. It starts feeling like a trap. And Amara had walked into enough traps to know that the most dangerous ones always looked, at first glance, exactly like a way out. Can 2 strangers share a wall, a last name, and a breakfast table, without eventually sharing the parts of themselves they swore they'd keep locked away? She said yes at 6:47 in the morning. Ethan was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, earlier than her usual start time, still in the clothes she'd clearly been awake in for hours. She didn't dress it up. She didn't attach conditions or lengthy explanations. She set his handwritten note on the counter between them, looked at him directly for the first time since he'd known her, and said one word, yes. Then she asked when they needed to begin the paperwork. He told her he'd already had his lawyer prepare the initial documents and that they could review everything together that afternoon. She nodded. And then, with a composure that Ethan found quietly staggering given the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to, she asked if he still wanted his usual breakfast or if the circumstances had changed his appetite. He almost laughed. Not from amusement exactly, from the specific surprise of someone who had expected gravity and received instead a woman already moving forward, already adapting, already refusing to let the extraordinary become an excuse to stop functioning. He said the usual was fine. She made it. They ate at opposite ends of the kitchen. And that was, essentially, the template for the first 2 weeks. The legal process moved faster than either of them said out loud they'd expected. Ethan's counsel was efficient, discreet, and had clearly processed stranger arrangements in his career without needing to understand them personally. The paperwork was reviewed, signed, and filed with a quiet thoroughness that felt almost anticlimactic given what it represented. The ceremony itself, if it could be called that, took place at a municipal office on a Thursday morning with 2 of Ethan's most trusted colleagues present as witnesses, both of whom had been given only the information they needed and had the professional grace not to ask for more. Amara wore a dark green dress she already owned. Ethan wore a jacket over the shirt he'd been working in that morning. There were no photographs. There were no flowers. And when the officiant reached the part about kissing the bride, Ethan glanced at Amara and she gave the smallest, driest shake of her head, and he told the officiant they'd skip that portion, and the officiant moved on without missing a beat. It was, by every measurable standard, deeply unremarkable. And somehow, for reasons neither of them examined out loud, it didn't feel that way at all. The first renegotiation of their arrangement came 3 days later, not through conflict but through the simple, unavoidable logic of shared space. Amara had continued working. She had insisted on it, firmly, because financial dependence on a man she'd known for weeks was a position she had no interest in occupying regardless of his intentions, but the nature of what she was working as had to change, immediately and visibly, because news of the marriage had already begun moving through the household staff and would shortly reach the wider social circle that his mother occupied. An employee could not simultaneously be a wife, at least not in any way that would hold up to scrutiny. So Amara stopped. And the loss of that structure, the early starts, the clear tasks, the reliable framework of knowing exactly what each hour required, left her with something she hadn't had to sit with in years. Unstructured time. Inside a house that had, until 72 hours ago, been the site of her confinement. In a wing that had been quietly prepared for her with a care she found more disorienting than any coldness she'd previously experienced there. Ethan, to his credit, didn't hover. He maintained his work schedule with the same discipline he'd always applied to it, disappearing into his office by 8 and rarely emerging before early afternoon, and he asked nothing of her time or her presence beyond what basic cohabitation required. But cohabitation, it turned out, had its own demands that no contract could fully anticipate. They had to eat, occasionally at the same time. They had to navigate a shared kitchen and a shared sitting room and the particular social choreography of two people trying to occupy space without accidentally communicating more than they'd agreed to. Amara dealt with this by reading. She had always read voraciously, and Ethan's library, which occupied an entire room she hadn't known existed during her time as staff, was stocked with the kind of collection that suggested someone had been building it with genuine intention rather than decoration. She found herself in there on the second afternoon, pulling titles carefully from shelves, and she was so absorbed in the spines that she didn't hear Ethan in the doorway until he spoke. He said she was welcome in there whenever she liked. She said she'd assumed so since she was already in it. He almost smiled. She turned back to the shelves. But something had shifted in that exchange, something small and almost undetectable, a very slight recalibration of the distance between carefully professional and something that didn't yet have a name. Over the following days, the library became a quiet common ground. They didn't always speak there. Sometimes Ethan worked at the large desk while Amara read in the chair by the window, and hours would pass in a silence that was, gradually and almost imperceptibly, becoming comfortable rather than careful. One evening he recommended a book without looking up from his laptop. She read the back cover, set it aside initially, then picked it up again at midnight and finished it by 3 in the morning. She left it on his desk the next day with a single sticky note that said she'd had some thoughts if he ever wanted to hear them. He wrote back on the same note. Said he did. Neither of them said anything about the notes. Neither of them acknowledged that the distance they'd both agreed to maintain was developing, in certain rooms, at certain hours, a series of very small but very deliberate holes. And the most dangerous thing about small holes is not that they appear, it's that if you don't address them early enough, they have a way of becoming something you can no longer patch. Something you eventually realize you never actually wanted to. What happens when the person who stepped in to protect you has no idea what they're actually protecting you from, and the truth, when it finally surfaces, is darker than anything either of you prepared for. Module 5. The Secrets They Carried. Opening hook question. What happens when the person who stepped in to protect you has no idea what they're actually protecting you from, and the truth, when it finally surfaces, is darker than anything either of you prepared for? It started with a question Ethan wasn't supposed to ask. Not because it was inappropriate, nothing about Ethan's manner had ever been inappropriate, but because it was the kind of question that, once asked, dismantles the careful architecture of not knowing that two people in a fragile arrangement sometimes need in order to function. They had been in the library for about an hour, the comfortable silence between them doing what it had been doing for days, slowly convincing them both that it was safe. Ethan had looked up from the document he was reviewing and asked, without particular preamble, how she had ended up at the Hargrove estate specifically. Not how she'd come to work as domestic staff. He understood the broad economics of that. But specifically here. Specifically this house. Amara had been quiet for long enough that he'd started to say never mind, that it wasn't his business, when she said it was fine. And then she told him a version of the story. Not the full version. The version that was true enough to satisfy a casual question without opening the doors she kept welded shut on everything behind it. She told him about the scholarship loss, the family crisis, the narrowing of options. She told him about a placement agency that had matched her with the Hargrove household and that had seemed, at the time, like reasonable luck in an otherwise unlucky season. What she didn't tell him, what she wasn't ready to tell anyone, least of all a man she'd known for less than a month regardless of what his last name now legally was that the placement agency wasn't incidental to her story. It was central to it. and the person who ran it had a connection to the Hargrove family that Amara had only discovered 3 months into her employment, by which point she was already financially dependent, already legally vulnerable, and already beginning to understand that the walls she'd walked into had been, in certain specific ways, built around her deliberately. She gave Ethan the outline. She kept the interior sealed. He listened without interrupting, which she noticed, because most people filled silences with their own commentary before you'd finished speaking. When she was done, he simply said he was sorry that had happened to her. Not sorry in the reflexive, social way people deploy the word. Sorry in the way that meant he'd actually processed what she'd said and found it genuinely worth grieving. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked back at her book, and he looked back at his document, and neither of them acknowledged that the room felt measurably different than it had before she'd spoken. But Ethan's mind, once pointed at something, did not easily redirect. Over the next several days, quietly and without announcement, he began pulling threads. It was professional instinct, the same mechanism that made him good at identifying risk in complex financial structures applied itself, without his fully authorizing it, to the information Amara had given him. He made a phone call to a contact in the regulatory space who knew the landscape of domestic placement agencies in the city. He had his assistant pull public records on the agency Amara had mentioned. And what came back was not alarming on the surface. The agency was licensed, had reasonable reviews, operated within visible legal parameters. But underneath those visible parameters was a pattern that his contact described, carefully, as a known situation that several people had attempted to escalate through proper channels with outcomes that had been, uniformly, quietly suppressed. The agency had relationships. Specific, documented, powerful relationships with a cluster of wealthy families in the city. Families who used its services repeatedly. Families who, it appeared, benefited from a very particular arrangement in which workers placed through the agency arrived already compromised, financially, legally, socially, in ways that made them extraordinarily unlikely to report mistreatment or seek outside help. Ethan sat with that information for a full evening before he decided what to do with it. Because what he was looking at wasn't just Amara's situation anymore. It was a system. A deliberate, functioning, well-protected system that had processed an unknown number of people through the same machinery that had processed her. And his family, his mother specifically, was not a peripheral participant. She was a repeat client. Which meant that what Ethan had initially understood as his mother's personal cruelty toward one employee now had to be recontextualized as something with considerably darker dimensions. He didn't sleep much that night. Not from distress, exactly, but from the particular alertness of someone who has just understood that the problem they thought they were solving is actually a much larger problem wearing a smaller problem's clothes. He told Amara the next morning. Not everything. Not the full scope of what he'd begun to uncover, because he didn't yet have enough confirmed to justify the weight it would place on her. But enough. He told her that what had happened to her appeared to be part of a broader pattern, that the agency had been used by multiple families in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, and that there were people in positions of legal authority who had apparently been persuaded to look elsewhere when complaints arose. He watched her face as he spoke and saw something he hadn't expected. Not shock. Not even surprise, particularly. What he saw was the specific, exhausted recognition of someone hearing confirmed what they had already privately known and spent years trying to decide whether they were allowed to say out loud. She had known. Not the full architecture of it, not the names, not the scale, but she had known that what happened to her hadn't been random. She had known that the walls had been arranged. She just hadn't had anyone with the resources or the standing to look at the same walls and confirm that yes, they were deliberately built, and no, you weren't imagining it, and yes, someone is going to have to answer for this. She didn't cry. She had cried about this alone, in the small hours of mornings she'd rather forget, enough times that there was nothing left in it that required an audience. Instead she asked, very quietly, how bad it actually was. Ethan looked at her steadily and told her he didn't have the complete picture yet, but what he had was already bad enough that he wasn't going to stop looking until he did. And that quiet, unambiguous promise from a man who had no obligation to keep it, was the most frightening thing Amara had encountered since the day she'd walked through the Hargrove front door. Not because she doubted him, but because she was beginning, against every instinct she'd spent years carefully constructing, to believe him. And believing people, in her experience, was always the first step towards something that hurt. Can you pinpoint the exact moment you stopped lying to yourself? Not the moment you admitted it to someone else, but the private, unwitnessed moment when the truth walked in and you couldn't find the door fast enough to show it out? It happened on a Friday. Not a significant Friday by any external measure. No anniversaries, no milestones, no particular weather that would make it memorable in retrospect. Just a Friday in the middle of an ordinary week, the kind that shouldn't carry the weight of a turning point but does anyway, because life has never been particularly respectful of appropriate timing. Ethan had been on calls most of the morning, the kind that require the specific performance of composure while internally managing several things at once. The ongoing investigation he'd quietly initiated into the placement agency, a difficult quarter at the firm, and the low-level constant awareness of Amara's presence in the house that he had been, with decreasing success, filing under background noise. He came out of his office just after noon with a tension headache that had been building since 8 a.m. and found the kitchen empty, lunch already prepared and covered on the counter with a handwritten note beside it that said she'd gone to the library and to eat before it got cold. He stood at the counter and read that note 3 times. Not because it was complicated, because something about the casual, unperformed care of it, the complete absence of obligation in it, given that she no longer had any professional reason to do this, did something to the headache that 2 hours of analgesics hadn't managed. He ate. He felt better. He didn't examine why. Amara, for her part, had been conducting her own private reckoning with considerably less composure than she allowed to show. The library had become, in the week since their arrangement began, the place where she did her most honest thinking, partly because it was the room in the house that felt least haunted by her previous life within its walls, and partly because the books gave her somewhere to rest her eyes when her thoughts became too loud to look at directly. She had been reading a novel, the second one Ethan had recommended, passed across the desk with the same understated certainty he brought to most things, and she'd had to stop on page 214 because the protagonist had said something that was uncomfortably, almost aggressively, applicable to her own situation. The character had said that the most exhausting thing about being guarded wasn't maintaining the walls, it was the constant low-level grief of everything you had to keep on the outside of them. Amara had closed the book. Sat with the specific discomfort of recognizing yourself in a sentence written by someone who couldn't possibly have known you existed. And then Ethan had walked in. He'd come to return a book he'd finished the night before, and he'd clearly been moving through the house with the slightly distracted momentum of someone still half inside a difficult morning, because he was halfway to the shelf before he registered that she was there and that something about the quality of her stillness was different from her usual reading quiet. He stopped. Asked if she was all right. She said yes, automatically, the way she said most things that weren't yes. He looked at her for a moment with a particular attentiveness that she'd come to recognize as his version of saying he didn't believe her but wasn't going to push, and then he did something unexpected. Instead of retreating to the desk or excusing himself, he sat down. Not across the room. In the chair adjacent to hers, close enough that the usual careful geography of their shared spaces was quietly, deliberately suspended. He asked what she was reading. She showed him the cover. He said he remembered that part of it. She asked if it had hit him the same way. He was quiet for a moment, and then said that it had, when he'd first read it, during a period of his life when he'd been particularly committed to pretending he was fine. The admission arrived so simply, so without performance, that it took her a second to register that Ethan Hargrove had just voluntarily told her something true about himself that he hadn't needed to share. That was the crack. Not a dramatic fracture, nothing that announced itself. Just a hairline opening in the careful professional surface they'd both been maintaining, through which something warmer and considerably more dangerous immediately began to move. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the investigation, not about the arrangement, not about anything that lived in the practical architecture of their situation, but about books, and about the specific kinds of pain that certain books could locate in you with surgical accuracy, and about what it meant to spend years being competent at your life while privately suspecting that competence and contentment were not, in fact, the same thing. Ethan talked about his father's expectations and the particular loneliness of succeeding at everything someone else defined as success. Amara talked about the professor who told her she had a sharp mind, and about the specific quality of grief that came with losing a future you'd only just started to believe in. They didn't touch. They barely moved. But by the time the light through the library windows had shifted from afternoon to early evening, something between them had been irrevocably rearranged. Ethan noticed it first, or rather, he noticed that he'd stopped noticing the time, which for a man whose days were structured around it was its own kind of signal. He became aware, gradually, that he was sitting closer than he'd initially sat, that the conversation had moved from careful to unguarded in a transition so smooth he couldn't identify where it had happened, and that he was looking at Amara with an attention that had absolutely nothing to do with concern for her welfare or guilt about his family's conduct or any of the other respectable, manageable emotions he'd been successfully processing for weeks. He looked away, found a reason to check his phone, stood up with the kind of deliberate normalcy that is its own form of confession, said he had some things to get back to before the evening. She said of course. He left the library, walked to his office, sat down, and did not, for several minutes, do anything except acknowledge to himself, in the privacy of his own head, that he was in considerably more trouble than any of his very careful planning had accounted for. Amara sat in the library after he left and looked at the closed book in her lap and thought about walls, about what they cost to build, about what it meant that for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, she had spent 2 hours inside a conversation and not once calculated how it might be used against her. Not once monitored her own words for vulnerability. Not once performed a version of herself designed for safety rather than truth. She had simply, and this was the part that frightened her most, been there. Present. Unguarded. Real. And the person on the other side of that had met her there without making her regret it, which was, by any honest accounting, the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she'd walked into this house. They both went to sleep that Friday night with the same problem, and neither of them said a word about it. Because naming it made it real, and real meant navigating it, and navigating it meant admitting that a marriage entered into as a legal transaction had developed, somewhere between page 214 and a shift in afternoon light, a heartbeat neither of them had authorized. And heartbeats, once started, are extraordinarily difficult to stop. What's more dangerous? A secret held so tightly it suffocates you, or a secret exposed before you've had enough time to understand it yourself? The news broke on a Monday. Not through any announcement Ethan had made. He'd been deliberately measured about how and when information about the marriage would reach his wider social circle, understanding that timing in these situations was its own form of strategy. It broke because his mother found out. And Eleanor Hargrove, upon discovering that her son had married the woman she'd been systematically dismantling for 3 years, did not process this information quietly. She processed it the way she processed most things that threatened her sense of order, through her network, immediately, and with a particular spin designed to position herself as the wrong party before anyone else could establish a competing narrative. By Monday evening, the story moving through the circles that mattered to Eleanor was not that her son had married someone she'd mistreated. It was that her son had been manipulated by a calculating woman who had exploited a position of domestic access to engineer a marriage above her station. Eleanor hadn't needed to say any of this directly. She was far too practiced for direct. She simply made 3 phone calls to the right people and let the architecture of implication do the rest. Ethan found out about it the way he found out about most things his mother preferred he not know, through someone in his professional orbit who mentioned it with the careful casualness of a person delivering a warning dressed as conversation. A colleague called Tuesday morning, ostensibly about a business matter, and then said before hanging up that Ethan might want to get ahead of some of the talk that was circulating. Ethan thanked him, hung up, and sat for a moment with the specific fury of someone who had anticipated this move and still found it, when it arrived, freshly enraging. He didn't go to his mother immediately. He went to his lawyer, mapped the landscape of what Eleanor had set in motion, and established clearly what could be addressed legally and what would have to be managed through other means. Then he called his mother and requested a meeting. She agreed with the pleasantness of someone who believed she held the stronger position. She was not entirely wrong about that, which made the meeting, 2 hours later in the estate's formal sitting room, one of the more precisely unpleasant conversations Ethan had experienced in recent memory. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. It was one of the things Ethan had always reluctantly respected about her, even when everything she was saying required a raised voice to adequately convey its wrongness. She sat across from him with the composed certainty of a woman on her own territory and told him, with genuine maternal concern threaded through every word, that she was worried about him. That she understood he had a good heart. That she knew he'd seen something in the girl's situation that had appealed to his sense of justice. She knew him, she said, she'd always known him, but that he had been taken advantage of, and that the right thing, the loving thing, was to help him see that before this went any further. Ethan listened to all of it. He let her finish. And then he told her, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, that he knew about the placement agency. That he knew about the complaints that had been suppressed. That he knew about the phone call she'd made, the one in the hallway, the one that had set all of this in motion, and that he was giving her the opportunity, right now, to understand that the path she was currently on had a destination she would not enjoy arriving at. Eleanor's composure didn't crack, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. She said she didn't know what he was referring to. He said he expected she'd say that. And he left. Amara learned what was happening through the household staff, specifically through one of the junior cleaners who had always treated her with basic human decency, and who came to find her that Tuesday afternoon with the uncomfortable urgency of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. The story being circulated about her was not subtle. It painted her as opportunistic, manipulative, deliberately predatory toward a man she'd assessed as a viable target from the moment she'd entered his family home. It attributed to her a coldness and a calculation that was, Amara noted with a grim private irony, almost exactly the qualities that Eleanor Hargrove herself had deployed against her for 3 years. She sat with it. She didn't perform distress for the junior cleaner's benefit, though the distress was real. It simply lived in her body differently than it might have lived in someone who hadn't already spent years absorbing versions of this particular message. The message being, you don't belong here. You reached for something above you. And we will remind you of that until you retreat to wherever we've decided you came from. What surprised her was what happened that evening. Ethan knocked on her door, not the library, not a common space, but her actual door, which he had never done, and asked if he could come in. She said yes. He came in and sat in the chair by the window and told her everything. The phone calls. His mother's narrative. The professional circles it had reached. The legal options available to them. He was thorough and precise and clearly had thought carefully about what she needed to know versus what would simply add weight without usefulness. And when he finished, he said something that she hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. He said he was sorry. Not for the situation in abstract. Specifically sorry that something he had initiated, the marriage, the solution he'd arrived at, had created a new vector of harm for her that he hadn't adequately anticipated. He said her reputation mattered, that what people were saying about her was wrong, and that he intended to make that clear, publicly and without ambiguity, regardless of what it cost him socially or professionally. He asked her what she wanted to do, not what he thought they should do, what she wanted. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the estate grounds were dark, and somewhere in the house the particular silence of a building holding its breath had settled around them. She told him she wanted to fight it. Not retreat, not manage quietly, not find the least damaging way to absorb another blow from people who had never once considered whether she could absorb any more. She wanted to fight it. His expression shifted, something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the same warmth, and he said good. Because he did too. What neither of them understood yet, sitting in that room with a decision fresh between them, was that fighting it was going to cost them both more than they'd tallied. Eleanor Hargrove had not made 3 phone calls and stopped. She had made 3 phone calls and started. And whatever was coming next had been set in motion before Ethan had even walked out of that sitting room, by a woman who had spent decades learning that the most effective attacks were the ones that arrived from directions you weren't watching. How do you fight an enemy who doesn't come at you with anger, but with paperwork, patience, and the quiet confidence of someone who has never once been told that the system wasn't built for them? The first formal move came on a Thursday morning, delivered not dramatically but bureaucratically, which is always the more frightening version. A letter arrived at the estate addressed to Amara, not to Mrs. Hargrove, not to Amara Hargrove, but to Amara by her previous name, which was itself a deliberate signal about how the sender categorized the marriage and its legitimacy. The letter was from a legal firm Ethan didn't recognize by name but recognized by type immediately, the kind of firm that existed specifically to pursue cases on behalf of clients who preferred not to appear directly in any proceeding. The letter alleged, in the precise and bloodless language of legal correspondence, that Amara had obtained her current residential status through a fraudulent marriage, specifically a marriage entered into without genuine intent, for the sole purpose of circumventing immigration proceedings. It requested her voluntary cooperation with an investigative process. It was signed by a name Ethan didn't know. But 3 phone calls later, he knew exactly whose money was behind it. And the answer landed in his chest with the particular weight of a confirmation you'd hoped wouldn't come. It wasn't just his mother. That was what the 3 phone calls established with uncomfortable clarity. Eleanor had not acted alone. She had activated a network, and the network had resources that extended considerably beyond the Hargrove family's own considerable ones. The man whose name Ethan had heard in that hallway phone call months ago, the well-connected acquaintance, the one whose influence moved through channels that didn't show up in public records, was the architecture behind the legal letter. He had done this before. Not with Amara specifically, but with others. People who had come too close to information about the placement agency, people who had shown signs of becoming inconvenient, people who lacked the standing or resources to withstand a sustained legal and social pressure campaign. He had a method. It was slow, it was expensive to resist, and it had a success rate that explained his confidence. Ethan called his lawyer and told him to clear his schedule for the week. Then he went to find Amara. She had already read the letter. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he came in, the letter face down in front of her, her hands flat on the table on either side of it in the posture of someone physically grounding themselves against the pull of something they'd half expected and fully dreaded. She looked up when he entered and said, before he could speak, that she needed him to know something. He sat down. She told him that the placement agency, the full truth of her history with it, the parts she'd kept sealed in their library conversation, was more complicated than what she'd shared. That there had been a complaint. That she had filed it herself, 8 months into her employment at the Hargrove estate, through a workers' advocacy organization she'd found through careful research conducted on her phone during the 20 minutes a day she'd had reliably to herself. That the complaint had been received, acknowledged, and then had disappeared into a process that produced no outcomes and no follow-up and eventually no response at all. And that 3 weeks after she'd filed it, Mrs. Hargrove had first mentioned, in passing and with perfect pleasantness, that visa irregularities could be such a complicated business. Ethan listened without moving. The complaint changed the shape of everything, not because it surprised him, but because it meant Amara had tried. Long before he'd appeared with his legal solution and his library recommendations and his carefully maintained concern, she had tried to use the systems available to her and had watched those systems absorb her complaint and produce nothing. Which meant the people they were now facing had not only the resources to attack, but the demonstrated history of successfully neutralizing exactly this kind of resistance. He asked her if she still had documentation of the complaint. She said she had kept everything. Every email, every reference number, every timestamp, on an encrypted drive she'd been carrying in her possession every day since, because she had understood from the moment the silence started that documentation was the only asset she had that couldn't be taken from her while she slept. She pulled the drive from her pocket and set it on the table next to the letter. The contrast between the two objects, the official legal aggression and the quiet, years-long preparation of a woman who'd known it was coming, was not lost on either of them. The following week moved at a pace that felt simultaneously too fast and brutally slow. Ethan's legal team began building a counterposition, which required assembling evidence of the genuine nature of their relationship, a task that was complicated by the fact that their relationship had begun as a transaction and had become something else in a way that neither of them had documented because neither of them had been ready to name it. His lawyer was diplomatic about this challenge. He said that genuine relationships didn't require performance, but that contested ones required evidence, and that the distinction between the two was unfortunately invisible to a legal proceeding. Ethan and Amara sat across from the lawyer together and answered his questions with the careful honesty of two people simultaneously trying to be truthful and to navigate the strange territory of describing, to a third party, something they hadn't yet fully described to each other. When the lawyer asked how they would characterize their current relationship, there was a pause during which Ethan looked at Amara and Amara looked at the table, and the lawyer wrote something down without pressing further. On the professional front, the pressure was coming from a different direction. Two clients at Ethan's firm, both of whom he now understood to be connected to the same network Eleanor had activated, began raising concerns about his judgment. Not about his work, which was unassailable, but about his personal conduct. The specific implication, floated in carefully worded emails and relayed through intermediaries, was that a man whose private decisions raised questions might not be the most stable steward of significant assets. It was a financial threat dressed as a reputational concern, and it was designed to force Ethan into a calculation. How much was he willing to lose to keep fighting? The answer he arrived at, alone in his office on a Wednesday night with the city dark outside his window, was that he was willing to lose considerably more than they'd estimated. Because what they'd miscalculated, what Eleanor and her network had fundamentally failed to account for, was that Ethan's investment in this fight had stopped being about justice in the abstract somewhere around a Friday afternoon in a library, and had become about something specific and personal and not remotely negotiable. He didn't tell Amara that on Wednesday night. He filed it away with the other things he hadn't said yet. The growing collection of truths accumulating in the space between what their arrangement required and what it had become. But the enemy at the door was not patient, and the window for keeping those truths private was closing faster than either of them knew. Because Eleanor's next move wasn't legal. It wasn't financial. It was personal. And it was already in motion. When protecting someone means becoming the source of their pain, is staying an act of love, or is leaving the most selfless thing you've ever done? Eleanor's personal move arrived in the form of a visit. Not to Ethan. To Amara. And it happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Ethan was at his firm for the first time in 10 days, having been persuaded by his legal team that maintaining visible professional normalcy was strategically important during the proceedings. Eleanor had known, of course, that he would be gone. She arrived at the estate with the unhurried confidence of a woman entering a building that still felt, regardless of legal technicalities, entirely hers. She found Amara in the garden, the same garden where Ethan had first proposed his solution, which felt, in retrospect, like a location Eleanor had chosen deliberately. She sat down across from Amara without invitation and set her handbag on the table with the particular precision of someone establishing territory, and then she looked at Amara for a long moment with an expression that was somehow worse than hostility. It was pity, practiced, weaponized, delivered with the fluency of a woman who had spent decades understanding that pity was the most destabilizing thing you could aim at someone who had spent years fighting to be seen as capable. She didn't attack. That was the thing about Eleanor that made her genuinely formidable. She never attacked when she could simply illuminate. She told Amara, in a voice of careful maternal warmth, that she understood what it was like to want more than the circumstances you'd been given. That she respected ambition, she always had. That she bore Amara no personal ill will, and said this with such convincing sincerity that Amara felt the specific nausea of watching a skilled performance from too close a distance. And then Eleanor said the thing she'd come to say. She told Amara that Ethan was losing clients. That the legal proceedings, the professional whisper campaign, the social repositioning, all of it was costing him in ways that would compound over time, that would follow him in his industry in ways that couldn't be fully undone, and that the people behind it had both the patience and the resources to keep the pressure applied indefinitely. She said this not as a threat, but as information. Neutral, factual, offered with concern. And then she said that Amara, if she genuinely cared about Ethan, and Eleanor suggested, with a small and terrible smile, that she could see that she did, might want to consider whether staying was the kindest thing she could do for him. Amara didn't respond. She held Eleanor's gaze for the full duration of the silence that followed, and Eleanor, to her credit, held it back without flinching. Then Amara said she'd think about it. Eleanor nodded, collected her handbag, and left with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted exactly what they'd come to plant. Amara sat in the garden alone for 40 minutes after the car disappeared from the driveway. She wasn't thinking about whether Eleanor was right, she was thinking about the fact that Eleanor was partially right, which was always the more difficult version of wrong to argue with. Because Ethan was losing clients. She knew that. She'd seen the emails he hadn't hidden but hadn't discussed, had watched his calls become more frequent and his office hours longer, had noticed the specific quality of tiredness that had appeared in him over the past 2 weeks that was different from his usual work exhaustion. It was the tiredness of a man fighting on too many fronts simultaneously, and Amara knew exactly what that felt like because she had been living it for 3 years before he'd entered the picture. She packed a bag that evening. Not everything, just enough. The encrypted drive. Her documents. The few things that were irreplaceably hers. She did it methodically, without crying, which she would later identify as the thing that should have told her something important, that the absence of tears wasn't composure, it was the specific numbness of someone making a decision their body knew was wrong before their mind had finished constructing the argument for it. She wrote a note. Rewrote it twice. The final version was 6 sentences long and said, essentially, that she was removing herself from the equation because the equation had become too costly for him and she refused to be the reason his life was dismantled. She thanked him. She wished him something good. She folded it and left it on the library desk, next to the book she'd been reading, next to the sticky note exchange that had started something she didn't have a name for and now would never need to find one. She picked up her bag, walked to the front door, and stood there for 90 seconds with her hand on the handle. She didn't hear him come in. Ethan had returned 2 hours earlier than expected, a meeting cancelled, his instincts pulling him back to the estate with an urgency he hadn't stopped to analyze, and he'd come through the side entrance and gone directly to his office and then, finding he couldn't concentrate, had gone to the library. He'd found her note, and he'd read it with the particular stillness of someone receiving a blow they should have anticipated and somehow hadn't, and then he'd moved through the house with a speed that was completely at odds with his usual composure, following the logic of where she would go before leaving, which led him to the front hallway, which led him to Amara standing at the door with a bag over her shoulder and her hand on the handle and her back to him. He said her name. She didn't turn around immediately. He said it again, differently, not louder, but with something in it that hadn't been in his voice before, something unguarded and unstrategic that bypassed every careful layer she'd built against exactly this kind of moment. She turned around. What followed was not the conversation either of them would have written. It was not articulate or composed or managed. Ethan, who communicated for a living and had built a career on the precise deployment of language, stood in his own hallway and told Amara the disorganized, unpolished, completely unlawyered truth, that he knew what his mother had said, that he'd anticipated the visit and hadn't warned her and that was his failure, that the clients he was losing were clients he'd assessed and decided he could lose, that he had done the calculation she was trying to do on his behalf and arrived at a different answer, and that the answer was not her leaving. He said that she had spent years having her choices made for her by people who had decided her well-being was negotiable, and that he was not going to be another person who decided that, even if he dressed it up in the language of sacrifice. He said she deserved to make the actual choice, but he needed her to make it with the correct information. And the correct information was that he didn't want her to go. She stood at the door with the bag still on her shoulder and looked at him for a long time. The hallway was quiet around them. Outside, the evening had settled into the particular blue-gray that comes just before full dark, and somewhere in the house a clock was marking time with the indifference of objects that don't understand what's at stake. She set the bag down. Not dramatically. Just set it on the floor beside her, The way you set something down when you've decided, at least for now, that you don't need to carry it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said that she needed him to understand something clearly, that she was staying because she was choosing to, not because she'd been persuaded, not because she had nowhere else to go, and not because the feeling that had been developing between them since a Friday afternoon in the library had overridden her judgment. She was staying because she had looked at the situation clearly and decided that walking away from it was the thing other people wanted, and she was finished doing what other people wanted. Ethan nodded, said he understood. And then, because the moment seemed to require something more honest than nodding, he said he was glad. Simply and without architecture. Just glad. She picked up her bag and took it back to her room and unpacked it in the dark without turning the light on, putting each thing back in its place with the careful deliberateness of someone recommitting to a decision they know will cost them something. Because staying was a choice. But staying meant that everything she'd been trying not to feel since a Friday afternoon in a library was now fully, irreversibly, her problem to deal with. And somewhere down the hall, Ethan was sitting in the library with her note in his hand, understanding the exact same thing. What happens when the injustice you thought you understood turns out to be the smallest part of a much larger darkness, and the people responsible have been sitting at dinner tables and charity galas and city council meetings the whole time, completely unafraid? Eleanor's personal move arrived in the form of a visit. Not to Ethan. To Amara. And it happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Ethan was at his firm for the first time in 10 days, having been persuaded by his legal team that maintaining visible professional normalcy was strategically important during the proceedings. Eleanor had known, of course, that he would be gone. She arrived at the estate with the unhurried confidence of a woman entering a building that still felt, regardless of legal technicalities, entirely hers. She found Amara in the garden, the same garden where Ethan had first proposed his solution, which felt, in retrospect, like a location Eleanor had chosen deliberately. She sat down across from Amara without invitation and set her handbag on the table with the particular precision of someone establishing territory, and then she looked at Amara for a long moment with an expression that was somehow worse than hostility. It was pity. Practiced, weaponized, delivered with the fluency of a woman who had spent decades understanding that pity was the most destabilizing thing you could aim at someone who had spent years fighting to be seen as capable. She didn't attack. That was the thing about Eleanor that made her genuinely formidable. She never attacked when she could simply illuminate. She told Amara, in a voice of careful maternal warmth, that she understood what it was like to want more than the circumstances you'd been given. That she respected ambition, she always had. That she bore Amara no personal ill will, and said this with such convincing sincerity that Amara felt the specific nausea of watching a skilled performance from too close a distance. And then Eleanor said the thing she'd come to say. She told Amara that Ethan was losing clients. That the legal proceedings, the professional whisper campaign, the social repositioning, all of it was costing him in ways that would compound over time, that would follow him in his industry in ways that couldn't be fully undone, and that the people behind it had both the patience and the resources to keep the pressure applied indefinitely. She said this not as a threat, but as information. Neutral, factual, offered with concern. And then she said that Amara, if she genuinely cared about Ethan, and Eleanor suggested, with a small and terrible smile, that she could see that she did, might want to consider whether staying was the kindest thing she could do for him. Amara didn't respond. She held Eleanor's gaze for the full duration of the silence that followed, and Eleanor, to her credit, held it back without flinching. Then Amara said she'd think about it. Eleanor nodded, collected her handbag, and left with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted exactly what they'd come to plant. Amara sat in the garden alone for 40 minutes after the car disappeared from the driveway. She wasn't thinking about whether Eleanor was right, she was thinking about the fact that Eleanor was partially right, which was always the more difficult version of wrong to argue with. Because Ethan was losing clients. She knew that. She'd seen the emails he hadn't hidden but hadn't discussed, had watched his calls become more frequent and his office hours longer, had noticed the specific quality of tiredness that had appeared in him over the past 2 weeks that was different from his usual work exhaustion. It was the tiredness of a man fighting on too many fronts simultaneously, And Amara knew exactly what that felt like because she had been living it for 3 years before he'd entered the picture. She packed a bag that evening. Not everything, just enough. The encrypted drive. Her documents. The few things that were irreplaceably hers. She did it methodically, without crying, which she would later identify as the thing that should have told her something important, that the absence of tears wasn't composure, it was the specific numbness of someone making a decision their body knew was wrong before their mind had finished constructing the argument for it. She wrote a note. Rewrote it twice. The final version was 6 sentences long and said, essentially, that she was removing herself from the equation because the equation had become too costly for him and she refused to be the reason his life was dismantled. She thanked him. She wished him something good. She folded it and left it on the library desk, next to the book she'd been reading, next to the sticky note exchange that had started something she didn't have a name for and now would never need to find one. She picked up her bag, walked to the front door, and stood there for 90 seconds with her hand on the handle. She didn't hear him come in. Ethan had returned 2 hours earlier than expected, a meeting cancelled, his instincts pulling him back to the estate with an urgency he hadn't stopped to analyze, and he'd come through the side entrance and gone directly to his office and then, finding he couldn't concentrate, had gone to the library. He'd found her note, and he'd read it with the particular stillness of someone receiving a blow they should have anticipated and somehow hadn't, and then he'd moved through the house with a speed that was completely at odds with his usual composure, following the logic of where she would go before leaving, which led him to the front hallway, which led him to Amara standing at the door with a bag over her shoulder and her hand on the handle and her back to him. He said her name. She didn't turn around immediately. He said it again, differently, not louder, but with something in it that hadn't been in his voice before, something unguarded and unstrategic that bypassed every careful layer she'd built against exactly this kind of moment. She turned around. What followed was not the conversation either of them would have written. It was not articulate or composed or managed. Ethan, who communicated for a living and had built a career on the precise deployment of language, stood in his own hallway and told Amara the disorganized, unpolished, completely unlawyered truth, that he knew what his mother had said, that he'd anticipated the visit and hadn't warned her and that was his failure, that the clients he was losing were clients he'd assessed and decided he could lose, that he had done the calculation she was trying to do on his behalf and arrived at a different answer, and that the answer was not her leaving. He said that she had spent years having her choices made for her by people who had decided her well-being was negotiable, and that he was not going to be another person who decided that, even if he dressed it up in the language of sacrifice. He said she deserved to make the actual choice, but he needed her to make it with the correct information. And the correct information was that he didn't want her to go. What happened next occupied the remainder of that Friday and most of the weekend. Rourke's findings went to Ethan's legal team, who spent 48 hours assessing what could be brought forward, through which channels, with what evidence thresholds. 3 of the other 43 affected workers were identified and contacted through the advocacy organization. A different coordinator, 1 Rourke had vetted, and 2 of them responded. Their stories mapped onto Amara's with the specific, sickening precision of a system that had been refined over years to produce consistent outcomes. One of them had tried to speak publicly 18 months ago and had been discouraged by a combination of legal threats and the quiet withdrawal of the support she'd thought she had. She agreed, when asked, to try again. The other said she needed time. Both responses were understood and respected. Because the decision to put yourself forward into a fight that had already proven it could hurt you was not one that could be made for you by someone who had more protection than you did going into it. Ethan understood that now in a way he hadn't fully understood it at the beginning of any of this, when he'd arrived at his solution with the confidence of a man who'd never had to calculate the personal cost of asking for help from systems designed by people who looked like him. Amara spent Friday night in the library. Not reading. Just sitting with the lights low and the folder Rourke had left, her copy, because she'd asked for one, on the table beside her. She went through it page by page, not quickly, not once looking away from anything difficult. She read the documentation of her own complaint, the one that had been filed and buried, and she read it with the composure of someone who had already done their grieving about this in installments, across years. In the small hours of mornings she'd spent alone trying to understand why a system that was supposed to catch people had instead dropped her. Now she knew why. And knowing was not comfortable. It was not the relief people sometimes imagined it would be, to finally have the explanation. It was something harder than that. It was the removal of the last remaining uncertainty, which had been functioning, without her fully realizing it, as a small and stubborn form of hope that maybe it had all been a mistake. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a choice, made by multiple people, over multiple years, with full knowledge of what they were doing. She closed the folder, sat for a moment in the quiet of the library, and then she decided something, not loudly, not with ceremony, just a clean and private decision in the low light of a room that had become, over these strange weeks, the place where she was most honestly herself. She was going to make sure that what had happened to her mattered beyond her own life. Whatever it cost. Whatever came next. When Ethan came to the library at midnight to check on her, not intrusively, just a quiet knock, just making sure, he found her sitting with a closed folder and an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not distress. Not exhaustion. Something that had moved past both of those into something quieter and considerably more powerful. He recognized it, because he'd seen it in the mirror on the nights he'd made decisions he knew would define him. It was resolve. And watching it settle across her face, Ethan understood that the woman who had spent 3 years learning to be invisible had just decided, permanently and without ambiguity, to be seen. Which meant the people who had built their comfort on her silence were about to have a very serious problem. What does justice actually look like when the system was never built for people like her, and the only way to reach it is to walk through the very institutions that already failed her once, carrying nothing but the truth and the terrifying hope that this time, someone will actually be listening. The decision to go public didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way most significant decisions do, incrementally, through a series of smaller choices that collectively crossed a threshold nobody had formally announced. The first smaller choice was Amara agreeing to a recorded testimony. Rourke had connections at an investigative journalism outlet, not a tabloid, not a platform interested in sensation, but the kind of operation that ran 18-month investigations and published findings that generated legislative responses rather than comment sections. The journalist assigned to the story was a woman in her mid-40s named Calloway who had spent the previous 4 years covering labor exploitation across the domestic work sector and who, when presented with Rourke's findings, was quiet for a long time before saying that what she was looking at was the most thoroughly documented version of something she'd been trying to prove existed for 2 years. She said it with the specific restraint of a professional who understood that excitement in these situations was a form of disrespect to the people at the center of them. Amara liked her immediately. The testimony sessions happened over 3 days, in a neutral location Calloway's organization provided, not the estate, not anywhere connected to the Hargrove name, somewhere clean and genuinely separate. Amara went alone the first day. Not because Ethan hadn't offered to accompany her, but because she decided that the first telling of the full story, the version that included everything she'd sealed away and everything Rourke's folder had confirmed, needed to happen in her own voice, in her own presence, without anyone nearby whose feelings she might unconsciously manage while speaking. Calloway asked questions in the careful, unhurried way of someone who understood that the architecture of a person's testimony could collapse if you pushed the wrong wall at the wrong moment. Amara answered them all, including the ones she'd never answered for anyone, about what it had felt like to file a complaint and receive silence, about the specific calculation of deciding to keep working for a family after she understood her vulnerability had been manufactured rather than incidental, about what survival had required her to set aside about herself in order to continue functioning. She cried once, briefly, about something that wasn't the worst thing in the folder, but was somehow the thing that had accumulated the most. The placement agency coordinator who had buried her complaint had sent a follow-up email 3 weeks later asking if everything was going well in her new position. Amara had replied that everything was fine. That detail, the politeness of her own reply, the instinct to protect someone who was actively working against her, had stayed with her in a way that the larger facts hadn't, because it said something about what 3 years of being made invisible does to the reflexes of a person who started out knowing her own worth. Ethan was conducting his own parallel campaign through different channels with different tools. The two clients who had been pressured to raise concerns about his professional judgment had been addressed directly, not defensively, not with the energy of a man trying to save his reputation, but with the full documented case for what the network behind those concerns actually was and how it operated. One client, after reviewing the material, withdrew the concern immediately and expressed, in measured but genuine terms, that he'd been maneuvered and didn't appreciate it. The other took longer and ultimately reduced their portfolio with the firm, which Ethan absorbed as the cost he'd already decided he was willing to pay. More significantly, he'd had a conversation with two former colleagues who now sat on a city oversight committee, a conversation that was careful, thorough, and which concluded with both of them indicating, without making any promises, that the regulatory angle of Rourke's findings was something that warranted formal attention through channels that weren't connected to the ones that had been compromised. The machinery of actual accountability was slow and resistant and required constant pressure to keep moving, and Ethan applied that pressure with a methodical persistence that had built his career, except that this time the stakes were entirely different in kind, and he was aware of that difference in a way that made the work feel both more important and more exhausting than anything he'd previously committed himself to. The network didn't sit still during any of this. The legal pressure on Amara's immigration status was maintained, a reminder that the original weapon was still loaded. Two people connected to the outer ring of the network, the municipal contacts Rourke had identified, began making quiet inquiries about the investigative outlet, the kind of inquiries designed to establish whether there was pressure that could be applied before publication. Calloway's organization, which had been through this before, documented the inquiries and incorporated them into the story as evidence of the network's ongoing operation, which was exactly the wrong move for the network to have made and which they would have known if they'd better understood who they were dealing with. And Eleanor, who had been conspicuously quiet since Ethan's warning in the sitting room, surfaced briefly through her lawyer, who contacted Ethan's lawyer with a proposal that was technically framed as a mediation offer and was actually a financial settlement suggestion that would require Amara to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement covering everything Rourke had found and everything Calloway was preparing to publish. Ethan's lawyer relayed it. Ethan and Amara discussed it for 11 minutes, which was approximately 10 minutes and 50 seconds longer than Amara needed to arrive at her answer. The second worker who had asked for time came back. Her name was not released publicly. She chose to contribute to the investigation through documentation rather than testimony, which was her right and was treated as such, but the record she provided filled two gaps in the evidentiary timeline that Calloway had identified as the story's most vulnerable points. With those gaps closed, the piece moved from nearly ready to ready. Calloway called Ethan on a Wednesday evening to tell him they were scheduling publication for the following week and to confirm that Amara had reviewed the final draft and approved her portions. He said yes to the first and said he'd check on the second. He found Amara in the library, where else, with a draft on her laptop, near the end of it, reading with a particular focus of someone checking not just for accuracy but for whether the version of her story on the page felt true in the way that mattered, which is not always the same as being factually correct. She finished. She closed the laptop. She said it was right. He asked how she felt. She thought about it for a genuine moment, which he had learned was what she always did before answering a question she took seriously. She said she felt like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told she was allowed to put it down, but whose arms still hadn't gotten the message yet. He said that made sense. She said she knew it would pass. He said he knew it would too. The piece published on a Thursday morning. By midday, it had been picked up by 4 national outlets. By evening, 2 of the municipal contacts Rourke had identified had issued statements through their offices, the careful, distancing kind of statements that indicated their legal teams had read the article and concluded that proximity to the network was now more dangerous than distance from it. The placement agency's website went offline at some point between afternoon and evening, which was noticed and documented. Calloway published a follow-up piece 48 hours later that named the agency's primary financial backer, the well-connected acquaintance from Eleanor's phone call, and outlined his documented connection to the suppressed complaints. His lawyer issued a denial by end of day that was, in the assessment of everyone who read both documents, somewhat less than convincing. The oversight committee that Ethan's former colleagues sat on announced a formal inquiry the following Monday. The machinery was moving. It was slow and it was imperfect and it would produce outcomes that were partial at best. Ethan's legal team was clear-eyed about this, and so was Amara, but it was moving, which was more than it had done for 11 years, and more than anyone who had built their comfort on its stillness had believed it was capable of. Eleanor called Ethan on the Friday after publication. He answered. She spoke for several minutes in a register he hadn't heard from her before, not the composed, weaponized warmth of the sitting room, not the distant authority of their usual interactions, but something that was either genuine distress or a very good approximation of it, which with Eleanor had always been difficult to distinguish. She said she hadn't known the full extent of it. He told her, honestly, that he didn't know whether to believe that. She said she understood. The call ended without resolution, without reconciliation, without anything that tied the interaction into a shape that was emotionally satisfying, because real situations between real people who have genuinely hurt each other rarely produce those shapes on demand. He sat with the call for a while afterward. The complexity of it, the love that existed underneath the damage that existed underneath the love, was not something he was going to resolve on a Friday afternoon or possibly ever. He filed it in the category of things he would carry forward without resolution and try to be honest about, which was the best he could do with it and which had to be enough. The inquiry was open. The story was public. The network was contracting under the pressure of exposure in the way that things built on secrecy always contract when the light reaches them. And Ethan and Amara were standing on the other side of the fight they'd committed to, tired in the specific, earned way of people who have spent everything they had on something that mattered. But standing, which raised, quietly and inevitably, the question neither of them had answered yet. The question that had been accumulating since a Friday afternoon in a library, through everything that had followed, through a bag packed and unpacked in the dark, through midnight checks and sticky notes and 2 hours of unguarded conversation that had changed the temperature of everything. The arrangement had served its purpose. The protection it had provided was no longer the primary thing holding it together. So what was? Can a relationship that started as a rescue ever become something real, or will it always carry the weight of how it began, the way a house built on someone else's foundation always belongs, somewhere in its bones, to the person who laid the first stone? The formal inquiry took 4 months to produce its initial findings. During those 4 months, life inside the estate settled into a rhythm that was entirely different from anything that had preceded it, different from Amara's years as staff, different from the careful managed distance of the arrangement's early weeks, different from the siege-like intensity of the fight at its peak. It settled into something quieter and more ordinary and, for that reason, more revealing than any of the dramatic episodes that had come before it. Because crisis, it turns out, is an excellent place to hide. The urgency of a shared fight, the momentum of a common enemy, the clarity of purpose that comes with having something large and external to push against, all of it had provided a structure that made certain questions unnecessary to ask, certain feelings unnecessary to examine, certain conversations possible to defer indefinitely under the reasonable justification that there were more pressing things to attend to. And then the pressing things, while not gone, subsided enough that the quieter questions rose to the surface with the patient inevitability of things that had always been there, waiting for the noise to stop. Amara began taking a course. Online, initially, business administration, returning to the discipline she'd been studying before the scholarship loss had redirected her life, but approaching it now from a different angle and with the considerable advantage of having spent years watching, from close range, how power and money and institutional access actually functioned in practice rather than theory. She was sharp in the coursework in the way her professor had predicted years ago, except that the sharpness now had an edge that came from experience rather than just aptitude. Ethan watched this development with an attention he didn't try to conceal. He asked questions about what she was studying. She answered them with a thoroughness she brought to things she cared about, and he listened with a genuine engagement of someone who found the subject interesting partly on its own merits and partly because of the specific way her mind moved through it. She noticed him noticing. Neither of them said anything about it directly. But the conversations got longer and the gaps between them got shorter, and somewhere in that gradual compression of distance, the arrangement, the word they'd both been using carefully to describe what they were began to feel increasingly inadequate as a description of anything currently occurring. The legal pressure on Amara's immigration status was formally dropped 6 weeks after the article's publication, a quiet administrative withdrawal that arrived without acknowledgement or apology, which was exactly what she'd expected and which she received with a specific, undramatic relief of someone removing a splinter they'd been careful not to press on for months. The fraudulent marriage allegation evaporated with it. The investigation it had threatened had been conducted informally and had found, with some thoroughness, that the marriage exhibited all the characteristics of a genuine relationship and none of the evidentiary markers associated with immigration fraud. The investigators' report cited, among other things, the sticky note exchange in the library, which Ethan's lawyer had included in the evidence package and which had been described in the report as demonstrating a quality of mutual intellectual engagement inconsistent with a transactional arrangement. Ethan had read that phrase and shown it to Amara, and she had read it and then looked at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, and they had both laughed. Genuinely, unguardedly, the kind of laugh that releases something that has been held too carefully for too long. The conversation they'd been not having happened on a Sunday in March, in the library, because of course it did. Not because either of them had planned it, they were past the stage of planning things that mattered, but because the library had become the room where their most honest selves had consistently found each other, and honesty, once it establishes a location, tends to return to it. Amara had been at the window with her coursework, and Ethan had been at the desk with something work-related that he'd stopped actually reading 20 minutes earlier, and the comfortable silence between them had reached the particular quality it sometimes reached. A fullness, a pressure. The silence of two people who are both aware of the same unspoken thing and have independently arrived at the conclusion that the speaking of it is overdue. Ethan put down his document. He said her name in the way he'd said it in the hallway the night she'd almost left. Not louder than usual, but differently, with something in it that didn't pretend. She closed her laptop. She waited. He said that the arrangement, that word, had stopped accurately describing anything about their situation for quite some time, and that he thought they both knew that, and that he didn't want to keep operating inside a framework designed for a circumstance that no longer existed, because doing so felt dishonest, and dishonesty with her was something he found he actively couldn't sustain. He said he wanted to know what she wanted. Not what made sense, not what was logical given the circumstances, not what protected either of them from anything. What she actually wanted. She was quiet for long enough that the clock on the library wall marked it. Then she said that what she wanted was something she'd spent a long time believing wasn't available to her, not because it didn't exist, but because the version of herself that had walked into this house 3 years ago had been systematically reduced to a size that couldn't hold it. She said that what had happened over these months, not the legal fight, not the article, not the resolution of the injustice, though all of that mattered enormously, but the specific daily accumulation of being known by someone who looked at her without calculation, who asked what she wanted and waited for the actual answer, who had recommended books and received sticky notes and shown up in hallways at the right moment not because he'd planned to, but because something in him had directed him. There, that accumulation had done something to her that she hadn't authorized and couldn't undo. She said she was in love with him. Said it the way she said things she'd thought carefully about, directly, without performance, with her eyes on his face rather than the middle distance. And then she said that she needed him to know that this was not gratitude. That she had examined it for that, thoroughly, the way you examine something important for flaws, and it wasn't gratitude. It was something that had grown in the specific soil of being genuinely seen, and it was hers, and it was real. Ethan crossed the library in a way that covered the distance between the desk and the window chair without appearing to be a decision, the way certain movements happen because the body has concluded the argument the mind was still conducting. He said that he loved her. Said it simply, without the architecture of qualification that characterized most of his important communications. No context setting, no careful framing, no management of expectation. Just the thing itself, placed between them in the afternoon light of the room where they'd first learned to be honest with each other. He said he had known it since a Friday that he could locate precisely in his memory, not as the moment it had fully formed, but as the moment he'd stopped being able to plausibly deny it to himself. She reached up and took his hand, not dramatically but with the natural ease of someone reaching for something that belongs where they're reaching. They stayed like that for a moment, Not kissing, not speaking, just occupying the same space without the careful choreography of distance they'd spent months maintaining, and the room held it without comment, the way rooms do when the thing they've been witnessing finally arrives at its conclusion. The inquiry produced its findings on a Tuesday in late spring. 3 individuals in municipal positions were formally referred for disciplinary proceedings. The placement agency's operating license was permanently revoked. The primary financial backer, Eleanor's well-connected acquaintance, faced civil litigation from 4 of the identified workers, including Amara, in a case that Ethan's legal team had helped construct and that 2 pro bono firms had joined because the documentation was, in the words of one senior attorney, the cleanest exploitation case she'd seen in 15 years of practice. Eleanor was not named in the inquiry's findings. The evidence of her participation was real, but sat at the level of client rather than operator, a distinction that had legal significance if not moral clarity. Ethan met with her once after the findings were released. The conversation was long and genuinely difficult and ended without resolution, but also without the door closing entirely, because he was his mother's son in some ways regardless of everything, and because Amara, when he told her about the meeting beforehand, had said only that he should go, that accountability and relationship were not always mutually exclusive, and that she wasn't interested in being the reason he severed something he might need later. He had looked at her when she said that and understood, not for the first time but more completely than before, what it meant to be loved by someone who prioritized your wholeness over their own convenience. 6 months after the inquiry, Amara completed the first stage of her business administration qualification with marks that prompted her professor to send a personal email noting that her analytical framework was, in his assessment, unusually sophisticated for the level. She forwarded it to Ethan with a sticky note attached. The same medium, the same small handwriting, that said simply, "Told you so." He put it in his desk drawer with the others. There were several by then. He kept them all. The estate had changed in the ways that estates change when the power dynamics within them shift, quieter in some registers, more alive in others, differently occupied. Amara had a room that was hers by choice rather than assignment, and a library that was theirs by the gradual democratic accumulation of 2 people's books on the same shelves, and a future that was not the one she'd had before everything collapsed, but was larger and more genuinely hers than that one had ever fully been. What they had built, the 2 of them, across the unlikely and painful and occasionally beautiful architecture of how they'd come together, was not a fairy tale. It bore the marks of how it had started, the way all real things bear the marks of their origins. There were evenings when the weight of what Amara had survived pressed close, when Ethan felt the residue of his family's choices in ways he hadn't finished processing. There were conversations still to be had, repairs still in progress, a relationship between 2 people who had entered each other's lives sideways and had to build, retroactively, some of the foundations that most relationships establish first. But it was real. Fully, specifically, irreducibly real, not despite the way it had begun, but in some ways because of it. Because they had seen each other first in extremity, under pressure, in circumstances that stripped away the performances most people use to introduce themselves, and what they'd found underneath all of it, in each other and in themselves, had been worth every complicated step it had taken to get there. At the beginning of this story, someone asked what you would do if the only way to save someone's life was to give them yours. Ethan Hargrove had answered that question with a piece of paper slid across a garden table, with a decision made in a hallway after 11 seconds of stillness, with a willingness to lose clients and confront his mother and stand in the path of a system that had been running undisturbed for 11 years. But here, at the end, the answer looks different than it did at the start. Because it turns out that giving someone your protection is one thing. Giving them your honesty, your presence, your unguarded self in a library on a Friday afternoon, that is something else entirely. And Amara, who had spent years being told in every language but words that she was not worth that kind of giving, had turned out to be exactly the person who taught him what it actually meant to offer it. Some rescues, it turns out, go both ways. And the ones that do tend to build something that neither person could have constructed alone, something that doesn't have a clean name, but that both of them, on a Sunday in March in a room full of books, had finally stopped needing one for.